Hey guys, what's going on? My name is Elbow Fever. I'm a former Tier 2 coach, and today we're going to be talking about compositions, how they're created, how they play with each other, and sort of the interactions between all three. So starting off, we're going to begin with a poke composition. Let's talk about poke. No, just poke without the W. All right, so poke is actually really simple for a lot of reasons. Poke has two major objectives that it needs to pay attention to whenever you play a composition that falls under it. Poke wants to keep distance, right? They want to stay at range. I'll put distance, right? You do not want to be close to your enemy while playing poke, especially if they're playing something closer to a rush composition or dive composition, right? Second thing we need to pay attention to is angles. I spelled that right, not angels, right? That's angles. Angles is going to be really important, as well as having off angles is going to be really powerful, and this is where poke truly shines when angles are introduced. Sure, distance is important, but angles wins fights, right? I'll put it this way. We're going to make a little chart. Make a little chart down here, right? We're going to put the enemy right here, and we're going to put your teammates here. This is the front line. Let's say this is your Orisa or something, and the enemy Reinhardt is trying to walk forward like this and take a fight with your Orisa, right, with the front line. Very standard. You see that a lot in your games. What an off angle is going to do, say in a position like this, it's going to create two different angles for the Reinhardt to look at. And right here, we'll call this like a 35-degree angle. It's pretty powerful. But as that Reinhardt starts to walk forward, say he approaches all the way up to here, right, he starts to push forwards towards that Orisa as planned, well, now this off angle becomes even stronger. Look at this angle. This is over 90 degrees right here. In this hypothetical, say this Hanzo or something is literally shooting behind the enemy Reinhardt, which just makes really easy damage, really easy shots for the Hanzo if no one is going to be contesting him. So these angles are going to be extremely powerful. And something we'll talk about as well is having this front line's great. Having this angle here is awesome. What if we have an angle like this? Ooh, now this is really strong, where we're putting pressures from three sides, and no matter which way this Reinhardt moves, theoretically, no matter which way he moves, whether he goes for the off angle or for the front line, he's opening himself up to more and more angles. So any forward advancement from this enemy team is going to be exposing himself to more damage. And let's be honest, that's probably something he doesn't want. All right, let's get all of this erased. Take our time with my eraser tool, get everything nice and clean, and we'll talk about the next composition. All right, this next composition I'm going to label as Rush. The reason I label it Rush instead of something more commonly used, such as what do they call it? They call it Brawl sometimes. People like to call it this Brawl. I call it Rush specifically because Brawl is sort of the win condition of the composition, where Rush is sort of the way you enable that win condition, right? So what is Rush? Well, what are the objectives of Rush? Well, it is kind of the opposite of poke, and you want to get close, right? Bring yourself to a brawl. Right, this is why I like to call it Rush instead of Brawl, because Brawl is one of the objectives of the composition. Next thing, you need to be fast, right? Let's call this rotations. Rotations in a Brawl is pretty much the same thing as angles, where the Brawl itself is what's going to win you the fight. The Brawl itself is what's going to happen in the fight, what's going to keep you guys alive and all that good jazz, would put you at advantage. Rotations is how you get there. Without rotations, you'll never make it to the Brawl itself. And then finally, we have the good old, ever-loved dive composition. Dive is amazing. A lot of people like to play it. It's a really good composition, especially in like Korea and stuff. They play it all the time, which is fun because dive is fun. It's a lot of individual skill. It's a lot of really cool tactics, and it's unlike Russian poke in a lot of ways. So where brawl wants to stay together, right, and poke wants to take angles, dive kind of does a mixture of the two. What they're going to do is surround the enemy, right? They're gonna surround them. So surround. Is that how you spell surround? I don't think it is. Is it just this? Wait, how do I spell that? Wait a second. This isn't good. I'm gonna Google it. I'm not even joking right now. Okay, so I was right the first time. I doubted myself. So step one, we need to surround the enemy. We're going to try to encircle them. We're going to try to take as many angles as possible, right? But not to poke, right? It's not the same thing as like a Hanzo taking an off angle. What we're doing is we are trying to collapse onto an enemy. What this would look like, right, if we were to draw it out the same way we did with the poke composition, is here's the enemy in the middle. We are trying to situate ourselves something like this, where our monkey can jump in, the tracer can start attacking from behind, and the Genji would dash in from this direction. So you see how it's a little bit similar to poke, as all these angles, right, are really important, but it's also really similar to rush in that you kind of end up in like a sort of brawl situation. The difference between brawl and dive is brawl is better at more sustained fight. They want to get in close, stay in close, and sort of fight in the pocket. Whereas dive, you can have different variations, but for the most part, a very simple way of playing dive is to get value from the initiation, which pretty much means get kills, right? Once you make the surrounding motion, right, that's going to be a lot of the time spent, the same way rotations and angles, you spend a lot of time to get there. Then the initiation happens where you actually collapse in from multiple angles. You put a lot of pressure from a lot of different places, and you should be able to pick up a kill. Now, this doesn't always happen. We could see some counterplay where you have something like in a Risa Rhine setup with a Baptiste and Brig, and like nothing is diveable. It just becomes super hard to kill anything in that situation. So instead of collapsing and looking for kills, we can collapse and look for cooldowns. And with our advanced mobility, we can get out of the fight and re-enter it faster than they can. So there's a lot of different interplay between the two. We'll get to that in a moment. All right, so this is pretty interesting. We have three major compositions: poke, rush, and dive. How do they interplay with each other? How do, like, in a rock, paper, scissors sort of sense, what beats what? Well, it goes like this. Dive is generally going to beat poke. Poke is generally going to beat rush. And rush will generally beat dive. And the reason for this is the off angles and distance for poke composition make it extremely hard for rush to actually land a brawl, because if they push onto the Uriso and they want to brawl, then the off angle is going to get more value, right? And the only way for rush to eliminate an off angle is for very advanced rotations where they take off the off angles, force them to play with the front line, and then they would brawl into the front line. If they can do that, then it's winnable, but it's very, very difficult to make these rotations. It's time consuming, and a lot of things can go wrong. Rush will generally beat dive. This one a little bit less so, but generally can beat dive, as dive takes a lot of time to set up this really good collapse. Rush moves together very quickly when they make their rotations, so dive has a very small window of opportunity to actually land a good attack during a rotation. And if the attempt of the initiation of the collapse doesn't work, then the brawl will win over time, right? So dive needs to get very high value very fast. And then finally, we talk about dive and poke. Well, if you are playing an off angle as poke, well, you're just going to get dove. And instead of, diving a group of 6, which can be difficult for a dive team, diving 2 people, I mean, at that point, it's a 2v6. The team with the off angles playing that 2 is gonna lose, right? So dive just picks apart poke and pretty much eliminates the possibility of playing off angles. So that's sort of the interplay between the 3, but that's not it, right? We're not just going to say, rush beats dive always. That's definitely not true. We have to talk about the inverse a little bit. So let's talk about that. Poke can beat dive. It is possible for poke to beat dive, but it's a big old juicy but. They cannot play with their off angles. A lot of times they're going to have to play with their distance, and really their win condition is to deny the dive team from surrounding. They have to make sure the dive team cannot surround the poke team. If the dive is able to surround, then you go to plan B, survive, which is just huddling up, making sure everyone is as secure as possible, getting into enclosed spaces where mobility is less powerful, and trying to outlast that initial initiation, right? That initial engage, that collapse motion, right? So the major counterplay is going to be poke needs to deny the surrounding process. So, I actually want to draw these arrows, these little dotted arrows like this. Okay, so how can dive beat rush? Well, we talked a little bit about this. I already alluded to it, but we'll talk about it once more, just in case. Dive needs to destroy rotations, right? Rush has to rotate. If Rush can make rotations, then they will be able to win the brawl if they can take it, advantageous positioning, and then diving into a team that is ready for you is going to be just catastrophic. During these rotations, the rush team is not in its brawl form, kind of like in Pokemon. What is that Pokemon that switches from defense to offense? Or one of those Pokemon that switches from its speed state to attack state. Yeah, you need to be destroying them during the rotation where they're focused on getting from point A to point B. If you're able to do that, then you should be able to win fights, as rotations are hard. You might be able to pick off people for mistakes, but even if the rotation is perfect, slowing them down, you're going to burn a lot of cooldowns, and it's going to make it very, very difficult for you to actually run away at an advantage, right? So cutting down rotations is going to be the big idea for dive. Now, rush versus poke, this one is probably the most lopsided of the 3 matchups. Rush really just needs to close the distance with poke and deny off angles, which is just so hard, right? Each composition we talked about before, like poke beating dive, needs to meeting dives need to stop the surrounding process. Dive versus rush needs to stop the rotation process. Rush versus dive needs to fight both the off angles and to close the distance. It's very, very difficult, and the more off angles the poke team can create, the more the rush team has to just run around wasting time trying to push them off, and the more time that it takes, the more likelihood that something will go wrong. And let me tell you guys, something always goes wrong. So, perfect rotations from rush. At that point, you might, if the poke team is really strong, they're getting pushed off angles and then remaking them before you can go for the kill. I mean, you might as well just swap. But of course, not an impossible task, just a very difficult one. All right, so the last thing we need to talk about, right? We talked about all 3 compositions, how they play, and how they play off of each other. Let's talk about hybrid compositions, and this is where this stuff really comes together. This triangle in the middle, that's an ugly fucking triangle. This triangle in the middle, that's still an ugly triangle. I don't know how to do this. Sorry guys, I'm a left-handed person using a mouse with my right hand to draw stuff, so excuse me for that. That's why I type everything. So the whole idea of this triangle is that there are compositions that fall in between these three compositions. Now, you'll never find a composition like dead in the middle, and if you do, it's a bad comp, right? You shouldn't have a Reaper, a Genji, and an Orisa on the same team, right? They all want to play a different style, and putting them all together is just going to break this whole concept of compositions. Where if you have something like, say, a Rush composition with the Hanzo, hey, we can make that work. So everything falls somewhere on the line of this triangle. Not in the middle. If it falls in the middle, then it's probably bad. Somewhere on the line here. So let's think of some compositions that sort of work inside this triangle. Let's take a Reinhardt composition. Let's say Reinhardt, Zarya, right? We have a Lucio, Moira, and our DPS, our Reaper. Okay, so all this is Rush. But then we have a Tracer. Whoa, that Tracer doesn't belong with the Rush team, right? If you play Tracer like a Reaper or something, you're probably not going to do very well. Well, what does this become? It becomes a Rush composition with dive elements, where Tracer can set up surrounds and collapse with the rest of the Rush team. So what will happen is the Rush team, like this is the core, the Rush team will push in onto the enemies, which will make blue in this case, and the Tracer set up over here can flank behind, and they can set up a collapse onto the team. So we're having the advantage of the Rush composition, but with some of the advantages of the dive comp as well. We're using the strength of both compositions to really hammer home our advantage. Now, this would put us somewhere right here. Let's say right here. That's a pretty good line for it. It's in between Rush and dive, but I mean, it's more Rush than dive. The Tracer adds dive elements, but it doesn't, make it a dive composition. Let's look at the inverse. How about a dive team with a little bit of Rush in it? Okay, so let's get a very classical dive. Let's get a Monkey, let's get a Diva, let's get a Tracer, an Ana, a Lucio, or maybe even a Brig, something like that. And then let's throw in, what's a good example of this? A Reaper. Sure, a Reaper. The Reaper would add a lot of brawl elements from Rush, right? So what's going to happen is we're still going to be playing on surrounding the team and collapsing, but now with the Reaper, we can stay in the fight a little bit longer. That Reaper can extend the initial initiation and make it a little bit more brawly, right? Where initially, if you fail the collapse phase of the dive, well, then you're just gonna have to retreat and go again. But with this Reaper, hey, now we can stay in the fight a little bit longer, because that damage, we have way more than we would have if we had, say, a Genji, right? With the Genji dash in with the initial right click is super strong, the Reaper can put out similar damages throughout the entire fight. So it's not quite a full dive, it has a little bit of Rush in it, but it's definitely somewhere here, where it's more dive than Rush. And then let's look at poke as well. All right. Adding poke is really easy to compositions. Like, say you want to have a Rush composition that has some poke, throw in a McCree. He's pretty brawly in the sense that he can put out high damage close up, and the flashbang is super strong close up, but he has range damage. So that's right here, right? Or the Hanzo, which is a little bit less. So if this is Kree, this would be Hanzo up here. And then with dive, hey, let's have a dive team and throw in a Widowmaker, right? The whole idea being that you can still have that surrounding and collapsing motion with 5 or 4 of your teammates, but then you have a little bit of distance and off angle from the Widowmaker that adds an extra layer of threat, right? But we can add poke, and let's have a little bit of dive in it, right? Let's take a poke composition and throw in a Tracer. Let's take a poke composition and then throw in a Mei. Right? These are all very standard ideas that we have seen before in pro leagues and contenders and such, right? A lot of metas will pretty much follow something along this triangle. Very rarely do we see pure rushes, pure dives, and pure pokes. Now, here's something interesting. This is all very nice and stuff, and knowing this triangle is wonderful. But how do you play against other comps that fall under this triangle? Let's say that you are yellow and you fall under this, right? Your rush with a little bit of dive, and your opponents, they're playing dive with a little bit of little bit of poke, right? Something like this. How can you beat this? How can you beat? Actually, you know what? I'll give a better example. Let's say you guys are playing pure rush. You guys are just absolute full rush, right? You are playing Lucio, Ryan, Zarya, Reaper, May, Lucio, and maybe a Moira, Bap, or maybe even a Brig if you want to go super all out, right? You are full rush. You want to get into brawls. You need to make rotations. And then the enemy is playing rush, but they're a little bit of a hybrid. They have a Hanzo instead of your May, right? How do you win this matchup, right? Without getting into the specifics of heroes and maps and such, what it comes down to is the poke team the rush team with a little bit of poke, your enemies, need to really lean into that distance and angles concept where the rush team, the pure rush team, is going to be leaning into that brawl mentality, right? In the actual brawl itself, the team that is pure rush will beat the team that is a hybrid of literally anything, right? Of any sort of rush. So instead of hybrid of rush and poke, they were hybrid of rush and dive. Well, guess what? That Tracer is just going to be worse in the brawl itself. So you take the brawl as much as possible and try to take fights where the surrounding and collapsing doesn't matter nearly as much. Oops, I didn't mean to delete all of that. I'm trying to just get the X. Just get the X. Come on, I can do it. This is harder than it looks. What if I just did this? Okay, that works too. So if you have a composition, say like, I'm gonna play a little bit of dive and rush, and they're gonna play a little bit of dive and poke, right? Well, if we look at this chart, you guys are much closer to dive than the enemies are closer to dive, right? They're closer to in the hybrids. So what that means is you should be leaning into these surrounding and collapsing concepts where the team with a hybrid of poke doesn't have nearly as much of that. All right, so there's a lot of really interesting interplay between compositions when we get into this hybrid stuff, and that's where stuff gets really, really complicated. It's extremely easy to talk about poke compositions, rush compositions, and dive compositions just standard, but when we add this triangle in the middle and we start talking about hybrid comps, well, that's when things get crazy, right? Who's winning here? A rush composition with a little bit of dive, or a poke composition with a little bit of rush, right? Who has the advantage there, right? That takes a little bit of thinking, but the more you use this, the more you really analyze compositions in games with this concept, the more you're going to find that it becomes easy to realize. This is extremely useful. What I suggest is probably not a ranked thing nearly as much. I would probably say this is for scrims. This is for contenders in Overwatch and Tier 3, where this becomes really important. But hopefully this can help you somewhere. Even if you're not scrimming yourself, you're not a coach, you're not a player, you just want to have fun in ranked, hopefully this helps you a lot with picking compositions, right? So don't fall in the middle. That's a bad thing to do. Find yourself on a hybrid and learn how to play each compositions, know your win conditions, and kick some ass. So a bit of a weird outro because I kind of lost what I was trying to say at the end. But yeah, at least this is a shorter video than last time. And it looks prettier, if not a little bit hard to read at sometimes because of this background. But this background makes it so pretty. All right, thank you guys for watching. My name has been Elbow Fever. Like and subscribe, and go to Twitch. Give me your money. Okay, bye.
About you and how you've been treating me, and I thought, why do I love you?
The house creaks as the sun hits my blind eyes. I can feel the cold outside.